Hello, my name is Scott King-Owen. I have a PhD in early American history, and I want to talk about the significance of eclipses in early American history, the ways in which early Americans thought about astronomical phenomenon and how it influenced the course of certain events. Let's get started. Early Americans were watchers of the skies and were aware of different kinds of eclipse phenomena, such as lunar eclipses. Lunar eclipses occur when the Earth casts a shadow over the moon. So the moon may appear to be red, as the example of the blood moon. And these eclipses certainly caught the attention of most early Americans, but they're not as dramatic as solar eclipses. In the case of a solar eclipse, the moon blocks the light of the sun. And these come in three flavors. If the moon is positioned in the right place to block the total light of the sun, we have a total eclipse. If the moon blocks enough of the sun, but there is a ring of light around it, this is an annular eclipse. And then finally, the moon is often in a position to block only partially the sun's rays. The way that the moon and the sun and the Earth interact in their orbits, how they spin around, how the moon spins around the Earth, affects who sees the eclipse and whether it's going to be total or annular or partial. So there are many times where eclipses happen. We're just not focused on them or paying attention to them because they don't appear in our area. Early Americans were aware of this as well. And you might be surprised to know that they were fairly sophisticated in calculating when eclipses would occur. In early America, science and religion were not necessarily as separate from each other as they might be in our own minds. Particularly in the beginning of American history, science was seen as the revealing of the divine plan for the universe. Puritans regarded God as a chief scientist. Deists also regarded God as this eternal clockmaker who put the natural laws into order, and nature functioned according to this grand design. So when early Americans looked at eclipses, they often saw the science working out as revealing how the creator of the universe had imbued and embedded into the fabric of nature itself all these wonderful markings that just revealed how powerful that creator was. You could know about eclipses in early America by reading newspapers, but more or less, almanacs are a popular source of getting information about when an eclipse will occur. These almanacs compiled astronomical data for the use of farmers and people interested in the movements of the heavenly bodies. And they also typically featured political and geographic information. Sometimes they featured also medical information. So it's kind of like having at your fingertips a small handy guide to life in the world that you could use for science reasons, medicine reasons, or political reasons. Many of these almanacs were published by people who did the amateur calculations themselves for the movements and the changes in the seasons. So you will see the name of the almanac maker on the front of the almanac. Now, early Americans had access to telescopes, and so they were able to watch the astronomical phenomenon as they occurred, and that's how they got the data, as well as, of course, using mathematics, known mathematical laws in order to track the movements of heavenly bodies. So for example here, this pocket almanac of 1765 for use in Pennsylvania and neighboring provinces by R. Saunders of Philadelphia would have contained information in it about the seasons, about politics, about geographical boundaries, important holidays and dates, and as you can see here, signs and planets for keeping aware of your astrological futures, so you know when things are going to be auspicious for certain behaviors. Here are some examples of early American telescopes. On the left is one by an early American mathematician and astronomer named David Rittenhouse that we'll talk about in a minute. And on the right was actually owned by George Washington. So these telescopes would have enabled them to keep track of what was happening in the heavens. So they were completely aware, if not always, sometimes mistaken about what was going on in the heavens. They were at least aware of the movements of planets, what stars were doing. Sometimes you could see information printed for special eclipses and observations of said eclipses in the newspapers, such as the picture on the left, where this person has calculated this information for the viewing public. On Saturday next, being the 2nd of May, the Earth will suffer an eclipse, or the sun will appear to be eclipsed according to the following calculations. So you can see here they've laid out all of these calculations. This is math being used here in order to establish what was going to happen. On the right is a broadside, which is a large printed sheet of newspaper that you would see out in public places. This one showing details of an approaching solar eclipse, showing people what they can expect as the eclipse goes through. Americans got their knowledge of these astronomical phenomena through people like David Rittenhouse, who was not only an astronomer, but an inventor. He made clocks. He was a mathematician. He was a surveyor. Anywhere where math was needed, science and technology were needed, you could find David Rittenhouse tinkering. He was pretty famous for constructing 2 orreries, which were scale models of the solar system. These orreries would allow people to see and visualize the universe, and then, of course, understand that this was the working of God's divine plan embedded into the fabric of nature. You can see here pictured is David Rittenhouse. He's got his finger on his calculations. He's got his telescope at the ready so he can observe the stars and the planets. This is Rittenhouse's orrery. You can see it's rather large in a cabinet. This one would allow you to visualize the motions of heavenly bodies. So you would probably most likely seen these at a public exhibition so that people could come by and look, or at a university. So universities would purchase these for the benefit and aid of students. Another famous almanac maker is an African American named Benjamin Banneker. Banneker famously predicted a solar eclipse for April the 14th, 1789, based on his mathematical calculations. And his predictions actually contradicted other astronomers. He turned out to be right. So Banneker's excellence in math led him to the notice of Thomas Jefferson, who paid attention to Banneker's work and said, this guy would make a great surveyor for laying out Washington, D.C. Banneker published his own almanac. You can see it's for Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia for the year of our Lord 1795, being the 3rd after the leap year. So once again, just like other almanacs, it would provide you with important dates, celebrations, astronomical data, seasons, calendar, all the information you would need to make it through the seasons and the year. Early Americans hoped that they could gather more and more data to reveal the workings of the divine plan for the universe by establishing observatories, or what one future president would call lighthouses of the skies. Most of the astronomical observations that we get in early America are made by private individuals. So they're sitting at home, they are looking in the heavens, they're taking notes, they've got their own calculations, and they are doing this long before there are actual observatories. The first president of the United States actually recommended to Congress that Congress allocate money to science. Congress was instead rather stingy and didn't see this as necessarily a worthwhile pursuit. But Washington and many like him wanted the federal government to put efforts into calculating, taking observations, and maintaining these records of the heavenly bodies. After all, this reveals the divine's plan for the universe. And, as Washington and others realized, observing the natural world could be useful for commerce and for trade. Jefferson used information about Americans' intellectual pursuits of astronomy to try to argue that Americans were not inferior. He wrote famously in his notes on the state of Virginia that America proved through several examples, like David Rittenhouse, that Americans were intellectually just as good as Europeans, and if Americans continued to study science and gain knowledge, they would be every bit the equals of all the famous intellects of the world. In many ways, then, science here is not only religiously revealing of God's plan for the universe, but it's also linked to building the nation. That America will be a nation of intellects and scientists if only Congress would put money behind it. We don't get the actual first professional observatory in the United States until 1843, and that is the famous Mount Lookout in Cincinnati, which you can go tour. So how did early Americans react to solar eclipses other than see this as an extension of God's divine plan, or see this as the working out of a national science that would promote Americans' intellectual pursuits? Well, we can look at that through the 1778 solar eclipse. This eclipse occurred during the American Revolution, the American War for Independence. And it was a total solar eclipse that was visible from the Carolinas into New England. Thomas Jefferson, sadly, was unable to see much because the day that it happened, it was cloudy in Virginia. So he was much disappointed. But soldiers elsewhere took note of it. Many Revolutionary War soldiers did, and we have their records. What's interesting is that many of them don't appear to be excited by it. It's as if this is nature, nature happens, get over it. For example, Revolutionary War veteran Joseph Plum Martin, who is pictured here with his wife, said, "We took no notice of the eclipse when it occurred in 1778. Other soldiers' accounts say that it happened, but they don't spend any great amount of time describing it or recording their feelings about it." And perhaps that's a thing that happens in war when you're worried about survival in battle. Maybe you don't have time to be necessarily so concerned about the motions of heavenly bodies. This is the path of the 1778 solar eclipse. So you can see the blue lines. It does go through the south, through the Carolinas, and then passes by just off the coast of the north. Many people recorded this. So for example, we have Thomas Cowper's drawings of this solar eclipse. He recorded data on it from England, Nova Scotia, Pennsylvania, and Newfoundland. His papers are in the Huntington Library, which you can visit and read if you'd like. The only flowery description of the eclipse, the only one that seems to be poetic or even remotely reactive emotionally, comes from a newspaper account in the North Carolina Weekly Gazette from New Bern, North Carolina. The author wrote, "The greatest eclipse of the sun ever seen here by the oldest people now living among us. It exhibited a scene truly awful," and they don't mean awful in a negative sense. They mean inspiring of all. "It was beheld with astonishment and gratitude to the supreme ruler," all caps, "of the universe, by whose almighty power the motions of such bodies are regular and uniform, and the delightful system of the world kept entire and complete." So notice the eclipse, as recorded here, displays that sense of the Creator has put all these natural laws into place. This is how the world operates. It's amazing to watch. It fills us with awe that we understand the world operates. It's a system. And that system is regular and uniform. These are nature's laws. So this is more poetic than many of the soldiers' accounts that we have of the 1778 eclipse. Between 1800 and 1830, a lot of the writing about eclipses will change its tone. And this is partly because we have more recordings of people's personal opinions of it, but also partly because America will start a movement called Romanticism. Romanticism takes science and religion and adds to it this element of the mystical, the mysteries of nature, this divine being that speaks to us in nature, in the rocks and the trees. And the mystery is much more emotional and less rational and just proof that God exists and God put all the rules in nature. We can see some of this emotion in a quote by James Fenimore Cooper. Cooper was an early American writer, famous for the Leather Stocking Tales and other accounts of life on the frontier. And he witnessed the eclipse of 1806. You can see from his account, which he later wrote down between 1833 and 1838, just how emotion has impacted his memories of what happened in 1806. Throughout the belt of country to be darkened by the eclipse, the whole population were in a state of almost anxious expectation for weeks before the event. So they knew it was coming. Thank you, almanacs. And on the eve of the 16th of June, our family circle could think or talk of little else. They're on edge. I had then a father and 4 brothers living, and as we paced the broad hall of the house or sat about the family board, our conversation turned almost entirely upon the movements of the planets and comets, occultations and eclipses. We were all exulting in the feeling that a grand and extraordinary spectacle awaited us, a spectacle which millions then living could never behold. There may have been a tinge of selfishness in the feeling we were thus favored beyond others, and yet I think the emotion was too intellectual in its character to have been altogether unworthy. Notice Fenimore's emphasis, Cooper's emphasis on the emotions, the anxiety, the anticipation, the extraordinariness of that experience. It's as if the mere science of an eclipse has now been transformed into something mystical and magical. And you're going to see much more of that kind of language in the eclipses that occur after 1800. One of the most famous of which is Tecumseh's eclipse of 1806. Tecumseh was a Shawnee Indian living in the Ohio, Indiana area after the American Revolution. And his brother was a leader of a spiritual revival that led Native peoples to unite against American expansion, to reject Americans' goods, to reject American alcohol. So Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa were trying to bring together all kinds of Native peoples under this new religious movement. The governor of Indiana's territory at the time, William Henry Harrison, wanted to challenge Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. So Harrison was trying to bring them down. And he wrote to them and he said, Tenskwatawa, if you are actually a prophet, if you are really this religious figure that you say you are, then you can cause the sun to stand still or the moon to alter its course. Oh, so challenge accepted. Tenskwatawa got news of the challenge, and he declared that in 50 days' time, the sun would not shine. Sure enough, the eclipse happened. June 16, 1806. The Shawnee who were in the path of the eclipse as it traveled across Indiana and the corner of Ohio were convinced Tenskwatawa was the real deal. Here is this prophet who has absolutely called it. He must have a connection to the great mystery powers of the world and the universe. Question is, how did Tecumseh, pictured here at the top, and Tenskwatawa, pictured at the bottom, how did they know? Was it actual mystical connections to the divine? Or was it possible that they had access to an almanac? We know that an Indian trader living in Greenville, Ohio, Frederick Fisher, was a potential source for information that maybe could have found its way into Tenskwatawa's prophecy from an almanac. We also know that Tenskwatawa predicted another eclipse for September 17, 1811. So it's perhaps possible that Tenskwatawa was using this information that he had from the secret source to solidify his ambition to unite Native peoples behind this new religious movement. We will never know for sure. This is the path of the 1806 eclipse. You can see that it goes across the southern portion of the United States towards the Great Lakes area. So this is where the Shawnee would have encountered it, that would have seen it. Americans who witnessed the eclipse as well recorded their feelings about it. This is a letter from Sarah Carey to her brother Sam about that same eclipse. Notice the emotion. Oh, then, oh, I cannot find a word to express the grandeur and solemnity of the scene. The glorious sun was entirely covered by a black ball, which would have indeed been frightful, but that from the whole circle of the midnight ball he gleamed forth his blessed rays of light, as if to keep alive our hopes of his return. This lasted for about 4 minutes. That means this would have been an annular eclipse. And there's a drawing that we have of this annular eclipse from 1806. Religion was also a part of the mystery of another eclipse, one much later, and involving an African-American enslaved man named Nat Turner. Turner, born about 1800, lived in Southampton County, Virginia. He was literate, and he learned to read and preach the scriptures of the Bible. So as a lay Baptist preacher, he was accustomed to reading the Word of God, and accustomed to teaching that Word to his fellow people. And about 1825, he began having visions, which is pretty common in religious movements for people to be inspired by what they're reading, the words that they read, to visualize certain coming prophetic events. On February 12, 1831, an annular eclipse came through Southampton County, Virginia. And Turner witnessed this in spiritual terms. He thought it was white and black spirits engaged in battle. And that told him the time was ripe to rebel against the white slave owners who oppressed him, his family, and his friends. Turner and his co-conspirators waited until August the 21st to start their rebellion. So it took a while after February 12th for the actual rebellion to kick off. And in the course of 18 hours, they killed their white enslavers, about 55 people. This was one of the most dramatic and devastating rebellions led by enslaved people in early American history. Turner himself, along with his co-conspirators, were captured. And Turner, after he told his story to a person who wrote it down in his famous confessions, Turner himself was executed November the 11th, 1831. This is the pathway of the annular eclipse of February 12, 1831. So you can see Mexico into the southern portion of the United States, and then up through Virginia. Turner and his conspirators would have seen this eclipse as a sign. This is a sign from the heavens. That's how Turner interpreted it. And they would have met in secret to plan their revolt. White Virginians reacted to the revolt with a great deal of shock and horror. This was the horrid massacre in Virginia, as this illustration shows, the enslaved rising up and striking down families, fathers, mothers, children, 55 folks. In the aftermath of this rebellion, Virginia not only tightened its laws regarding slavery, but it also began to accuse Northerners of stirring up the kinds of rebellious behaviors that led the enslaved to seek freedom. Finally, this eclipse was a famous one in that it was the subject of one of the earliest published eclipse maps in the United States. So this map shown here shows the path of this annular eclipse as it went through Southampton County, Virginia, where Turner lived. Okay, so what I've hoped to have shown you through this short introduction to eclipses in early American history is that Americans were very much scientifically aware of eclipses. They had technology, they had the math, they had the data to study and analyze these astronomical phenomenon, but they interpreted them in different ways. Sometimes they saw them as evidence of the working of a science-minded, rational deity, putting laws, embedding natural laws into the universe. Other times they saw these eclipses in very deeply mystical and spiritual terms, especially after 1800. So eclipses do have an important place in the story of early America.